Alice wasn't sure when it had begun, but there was one thing she knew for certain. She had been here before. It wasn't the kind of certainty that made sense, but more of a gnawing familiarity that pressed against the edges of her mind, fussy and unclear, yet undeniably there. The forest around her was thick with shadows, the trees towering over her like skeletal sentinels, their branches twisting together in a dense web above, blotting out the sky. The ground beneath her feet was soft, too soft, like decaying leaves piled on something alive. She had no memory of how she'd arrived in this place. In fact, the moments before now were completely blank, like the flicker of a dream just beyond her reach. Ahead, something glimmered in the half-light, a faint reflection catching her eye. She stepped closer, her breath shallow as her gaze fell on an old pocket watch lying in the undergrowth, its surface dull and scratched, but the hands spinning erratically. Tick, tick, tick. The sound grew louder, oppressive, as if the ticking wasn't coming from the watch itself, but from somewhere deep inside her mind. Alice bent down, hesitant to touch it, but a soft whisper drifted through the air, stopping her cold. "You've been here before." Her head snapped up, and she scanned the twisted forest around her, heart pounding in her chest. There was no one there, just the endless sprawl of trees, their bark gnarled into faces that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. "Alice," the voice whispered again, teasing and familiar, like a forgotten memory. "Who's there?" she called out, though her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the thick air around her. A low chuckle echoed through the trees, and slowly, impossibly, a grin appeared in the darkness. Two crescent-shaped slashes hanging in the air, glowing a sickly yellow. "You're late," the Cheshire Cat said, its grin widening as its form began to materialize. Not the soft, playful creature Alice remembered, but a monstrous shadow of what it once was. Its fur was matted, its body translucent, like smoke curling through the air. The grin, however, was far too wide, as though someone had taken a blade and sliced it open from ear to ear. "Late?" Alice stammered. "Late for what?" The cat's eyes narrowed into gleaming slits. "For your own reckoning, of course. You always come back, but you never remember why." "Back?" Alice took a step backward, her pulse quickening. "What are you talking about?" "You'll see," the cat purred, circling her, its disembodied grin floating just behind her shoulder. "Wonderland has its claws in you, Alice, and this time, it's not letting go." The ground beneath Alice seemed to shift, the soft earth pulling at her shoes like quicksand. Panic surged through her, but before she could ask another question, the cat vanished, leaving only its mocking laughter hanging in the air. Alice turned in circles, trying to find her way out of the twisted forest, but the path she had walked was already gone. It was as if the trees had swallowed it whole, their roots curling together like gnarled fingers. She had no choice but to move forward, though each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself didn't want her to leave. As she pushed through the thicket, the soft ticking of the pocket watch followed her, growing louder with each moment. And then, through the trees, she saw it. A flash of white. The white rabbit stood at the edge of a clearing, but he was not the hurried, anxious guide she remembered. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his fur was matted with dirt, patches of it missing altogether. He clutched his watch in trembling hands, its ticking off beat, the hand spinning wildly in reverse. "I'm too late," he muttered, ice darting around the clearing. "Too late, too late, too late." "Rabbit!" Alice called out, stepping toward him. Relief briefly washed over her. Finally, a familiar face. "What's happening? Where am I?" The rabbit's head snapped towards her, his gaze unfocused and wild. "Time doesn't work here. It never did. You think you can escape, but you can't run from it. Not anymore." "Run from what?" Alice pressed, a sinking feeling in her chest. The rabbit took a step backward, clutching the broken watch tighter. "You're too late too, Alice. You always are." Before she could ask another question, the rabbit turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. Alice hesitated for only a moment before chasing after him, branches snagging at her dress, roots tripping her as if the very forest were conspiring against her. But no matter how fast she ran, the rabbit was always just out of reach, his figure flickering like a mirage in the distance. Eventually, the forest opened up into another clearing, a wide, empty space where the ground seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. At the center stood a long table, covered in broken teacups and half-rotten pastries. The scent of decay hung in the air, and at the head of the table sat the Mad Hatter. But this was not the whimsical host she remembered. His movements were jerky, his limbs twisting at odd angles as if he were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and his grin was a grotesque parody of joy. "Ah, Alice," the Hatter crowed, his voice too loud, too forced. "Come, join the party. We've been waiting for you." Alice swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she approached the table. "Hatter, what's going on here? This place, it's different, darker." The Hatter's head jerked to the side as he laughed, a high manic sound that made Alice's skin crawl. "Different? Darker? Oh, Alice, it's always been this way. You just didn't see it before." "I don't understand," she whispered, glancing around at the decaying scene. The teacups were cracked, the pastries crawling with insects. Everything felt wrong, like a nightmare that refused to end. The Hatter leaned forward, his grin stretching even wider. "You're not here to escape, Alice. You're here to remember." Alice backed away from the table, her heart racing. Every word the Hatter spoke only deepened her sense of dread, a feeling that clawed at the edges of her mind, threatening to tear it apart. "You're lying," she whispered, but the words felt weak, hollow. The Hatter laughed again, but this time his laughter echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the trees, growing louder until it filled the clearing. Alice turned and fled, running blindly into the forest, her vision swimming with panic. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted faces whispering her name. And somewhere in the distance, she heard the ticking of the rabbit's watch, counting down to something inevitable. She didn't stop running until she burst through another thicket, finding herself in a small clearing, her breath ragged. And there, standing side by side, were Tweedledee and Tweedledum. But they weren't the bumbling comical figures she remembered. Their faces were blank, their eyes empty, and their movements were slow, deliberate, as if they were weighed down by something unseen. "Alice," Tweedledee said, his voice a flat monotone. "Alice," echoed Tweedledum. She stepped toward them, her pulse racing. "What's happening to this place? Why can't I find my way out?" Tweedledee tilted his head to the side, his expression unreadable. "There's no way out." Tweedledum stepped closer, his voice low and conspiratorial. "But there is a choice." "A choice?" Alice frowned, glancing between them. "What choice?" Tweedledee pointed to a path behind him, shadowed and winding, disappearing into the thick of the forest. "You could go that way. It leads deeper into Wonderland, to the Queen." Tweedledum pointed to another path, this one barely visible, overgrown with thorns and vines. "Or you could go that way. But be warned, it's the path of truth." Alice hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Something about both paths felt wrong, twisted. She knew that neither would lead to safety, but the thought of staying where she was, trapped in this limbo, was unbearable. "Choose wisely, Alice," Tweedledee said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "Or don't," Tweedledum added with a sinister grin. "It won't matter in the end." After choosing the path that led deeper into Wonderland, Alice found herself standing before the crumbling remains of the Queen's castle. Once grand and opulent, it was now a decaying ruin, overtaken by thorny vines that twisted around the cracked stone walls like serpents. The air was thick with the scent of rot, and somewhere inside, the Queen's voice echoed, sharp and commanding. "Off with her head!" the Queen bellowed, her voice ringing through the empty halls. "Off with her head!" Alice entered the castle cautiously, her steps echoing off the cold stone floor. The Queen sat on her crumbling throne, surrounded by faceless figures, souls trapped in Wonderland, their features blurred and indistinct. And when the Queen turned her gaze on Alice, her eyes burned with fury. "You've returned," the Queen said, her lips curling into a sneer. "You thought you could escape, but Wonderland always claims what's hers." Alice shook her head, stepping back. I didn't mean to." "You can't hide from your guilt, Alice," the Queen hissed, rising from her throne. "You've been running from it for so long, but now it's time to pay the price." As Alice fled the Queen's castle, she found herself in a vast labyrinth, its walls twisting and shifting, closing in around her. The mirrors that lined the labyrinth reflected not just her image, but distorted, grotesque versions of herself. Twisted smiles, hollow eyes, all watching her, judging her. Each step she took felt like a step deeper into madness. Time no longer had any meaning here. Days blended into nights, seconds stretched into hours, and the ticking of the rabbit's watch followed her, relentless, counting down to something she couldn't escape. She stumbled upon the caterpillar, now a decaying figure wrapped in dark, smoking tendrils. His once philosophical tone was now bitter, venomous. "You thought you could change," he muttered. "You thought you could escape. But transformation isn't always a blessing, Alice. Sometimes it's a curse." Finally, at the heart of the labyrinth, Alice found herself standing before an old, decrepit asylum. Inside, the walls were lined with mirrors, and in each reflection, she saw distorted versions of herself, twisted, broken images that mirrored her fractured mind. And there, standing in the center of the room, was herself, another Alice, staring back at her with cold, empty eyes. "This isn't Wonderland," the other Alice said, her voice echoing through the room. "This is your mind." Alice stumbled back, her heart racing. "No, that's not possible." You've been here all along, the other Alice continued, stepping closer. You created this place. Wonderland is your prison, a way to hide from the truth. But you can't run from it anymore. The truth hit Alice like a wave of cold water, the memories flooding back. Hospitals, doctors, medication. Wonderland had never been real. It had always been a construct of her mind, a way to protect herself from the pain of the real world. But now there was no escape. Wonderland had claimed her, and she was trapped in an endless loop of her own madness. In the final moments, as Alice tried to run, her reflection in the mirror grinned, a wide, twisted smile, just like the Cheshire Cat's. And as she reached out, the mirror pulled her in, trapping her forever in the dark corners of her own mind. Alice's reflection smiled, an eerie, hollow grin, as the mirrors around her shattered, leaving her alone in the endless maze of Wonderland, doomed to repeat the cycle over and over again. Thank you for joining us in the world of Twilight Fables. If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more.